Free market housing. A free market housing economy is when the price of homes and rentals is determined entirely by supply and demand, with little to no interference from the government. If more people want to live in a city than there are homes available, prices go up. If demand drops, prices follow. The United States, the United Kingdom, and Australia are some of the clearest examples of free market housing economies in the world. In these countries, private developers decide what gets built, where it gets built, and at what price it is sold or rented. The government's role is limited mostly to setting zoning laws and safety regulations. The biggest advantage of a free market system is that it encourages construction and investment, since developers are motivated by profit. The problem, however, is that when profit is the only driver, affordable housing is often the first thing to disappear. Builders have little incentive to construct homes for low-income families when luxury developments generate far higher returns. Public housing. Public housing is when the government builds, owns, and manages residential properties and rents them to citizens, usually at prices well below the market rate. The goal is simple: to ensure that people who cannot compete in the open market still have a safe place to live. Some of the most well-known public housing systems exist in Singapore, where the government-built Housing Development Board provides homes for over 80% of the population across all income levels. In the United States, public housing is far more limited, making up less than 5% of the rental market and mostly serving low-income households. The strength of public housing is that it provides stability and affordability for those who need it most. The weakness is that when governments underfund or mismanage public housing systems, the properties deteriorate, waiting lists grow long, and the people who depend on it most are left in difficult conditions. Social housing. Social housing is similar to public housing, but with one important distinction: it is not always run directly by the government. Instead, it is often managed by non-profit organizations, housing associations, or community groups that are partially funded by the state. The goal is the same: to provide housing at below-market rents to people who cannot afford the open market. Countries like the Netherlands, Austria, and France have some of the largest social housing systems in the world. In Vienna, Austria, social housing covers nearly half of all homes in the city and serves residents across a wide range of incomes, not just the poorest. The advantage of social housing is that it creates stable, mixed-income communities and removes housing from pure profit-driven logic. The downside is that demand almost always exceeds supply, because when housing is offered below market rates, more people want it than there are units available, leading to long waiting lists and strict eligibility rules. Cooperative housing. A housing cooperative is when a group of residents collectively own the building they live in. Instead of paying rent to a landlord or a mortgage to a bank for an individual unit, each resident buys a share in the cooperative corporation that owns the entire property. In return, they get the right to live in a unit and a vote in how the building is managed. Think of it like owning a small piece of a company that also happens to be your home. Housing cooperatives are common in New York City, Germany, and Scandinavia. There are two main types: market rate cooperatives, where shares can be bought and sold at whatever price the market allows, and limited equity cooperatives, where resale profits are capped to keep housing affordable for future members. The advantage of cooperatives is that residents have genuine control over their living situation, and costs tend to stay lower than typical rentals. The challenge is that getting a cooperative started requires significant upfront capital, and not all residents are comfortable with the responsibilities of shared governance. Community Land Trust. A community land trust is a non-profit organization that permanently owns land on behalf of a neighborhood or community. It then sells or leases the homes sitting on that land to individual buyers or renters at affordable prices. The key idea is that by separating the ownership of land from the ownership of the home, the cost of buying a house drops significantly, since buyers are not paying for the land underneath it. The land trust holds that land in trust forever, which means it can never be sold off for profit or lost to rising property values. Burlington, Vermont, was home to one of the earliest and most successful community land trusts in the United States. As of 2024, there are over 300 community land trusts operating across 48 states. The benefit is that affordability is locked in permanently. Even as a neighborhood becomes more expensive, homes on community land trust properties stay within reach of working families. The limitation is that when a homeowner sells, their profit is restricted by a resale formula, meaning they cannot fully benefit from a sharp rise in property values the way a conventional homeowner would. Financialized housing. Financialized housing is what happens when large corporations, investment firms, and real estate investment trusts, known as REITs, treat residential housing primarily as a financial asset, rather than a place for people to live. Instead of individual landlords renting out a property or two, enormous companies own thousands of homes and apartment buildings, managing them like stocks in a portfolio. This model accelerated significantly after the 2008 financial crisis, when many families lost their homes to foreclosure and large investment firms bought those properties in bulk. In the United States, firms like Blackstone became some of the largest landlords in the country virtually overnight. The advantage of institutional ownership, its supporters argue, is that large companies can invest in professional maintenance and management. The problem is that these companies are accountable to shareholders first, meaning rent increases, fees, and evictions are often driven by profit targets rather than a resident's ability to pay. Many economists argue that financialized housing is a major driver of the affordability crisis seen in major cities around the world today. Rent-controlled housing. Rent-controlled housing is when a government places legal limits on how much a landlord can charge for rent or how much they can increase rent from one year to the next. It is not a housing economy on its own, but rather a policy layer that gets placed on top of a housing market to protect long-term tenants from being priced out of their homes. New York City has one of the most well-known rent control systems in the world, where some tenants pay rents that have barely changed in decades. Sweden, Germany, and the Netherlands also operate various forms of rent regulation. The argument in favor of rent control is that it gives renters stability and prevents displacement in rapidly changing neighborhoods. The argument against it is that when landlords cannot raise rents, they have less incentive to maintain properties or build new ones, which can shrink the overall supply of available housing over time. Economists remain divided on whether rent control helps or hurts housing affordability in the long run. Subsidized housing. Subsidized housing is when the government does not build or manage housing directly, but instead uses financial incentives to encourage private developers or non-profits to create affordable units. These incentives usually come in the form of tax credits, grants, or low-interest loans. In the United States, the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit Program, introduced in 1986, has become the primary tool for funding affordable housing construction, financing more than 3 million units over the decades since. In exchange for receiving tax benefits, developers agree to rent a portion of their units at below-market rates for a set period of time, often 15 to 30 years. The advantage of subsidized housing is that it uses private sector efficiency to build more homes without requiring the government to own or manage property directly. The drawback is that the affordability is often temporary. Once the subsidy period expires, landlords are free to raise rents to market rates, and many previously affordable units disappear from the affordable stock entirely. Mixed-income housing. Mixed-income housing is a development model where affordable units and market-rate units are deliberately placed in the same building or neighborhood. The goal is to avoid concentrating poverty in one area while still providing housing to lower-income residents. Many cities around the world have adopted inclusionary zoning policies that require private developers to include a certain percentage of affordable units in any new building they construct. Vienna, Austria, is widely considered one of the best examples of mixed-income housing done well, where working-class residents, middle-income families, and higher earners all live side by side in well-maintained, government-supported buildings. In theory, mixed-income housing prevents the social isolation that can come from segregated housing. In practice, the challenge is ensuring that affordable units do not get treated as second-class spaces within buildings that otherwise cater to wealthier residents, a problem that critics sometimes refer to as poor doors, separate entrances or facilities for affordable tenants. Informal housing. Informal housing refers to settlements and structures that exist outside the official legal and regulatory frameworks of a city or country. These are homes that were built without permits, on land the residents do not legally own, or in ways that do not meet official building codes. Informal settlements are found on every continent, but are most widespread in rapidly growing cities across Asia, Africa, and Latin America. In Brazil, these communities are called favelas. In South Africa, they are called townships. In India, they are called slums. Despite the conditions they are often associated with, informal housing communities are not simply the result of poverty or disorder. They are, in many cases, highly organized, economically active neighborhoods that developed because formal housing systems failed to keep up with the pace of population growth. The challenges that residents of informal housing often lack legal protections, access to clean water and sanitation, and security of tenure, meaning they can be evicted without warning if authorities decide to clear the land for other uses. Build-to-rent housing. Build-to-rent is a housing model where entire residential developments are constructed from the ground up specifically to be rented out, never sold. Unlike traditional housing where developers sell individual units to buyers, build-to-rent buildings are owned by a single company or investment fund that manages the entire complex as a rental business. This model has grown rapidly in the United Kingdom, Australia, and the United States over the past decade. The appeal for investors is a stable, long-term income stream from rents. The appeal for renters, in theory, is professionally managed buildings with amenities like gyms, concierge services, and flexible lease terms. The concern, however, is that build-to-rent developments are primarily designed around what attracts higher-earning tenants rather than what a city's broader population needs. As large investment funds pour more money into build-to-rent, critics argue it deepens the financialization of housing and further reduces the stock of homes available for purchase by ordinary families looking to build long-term wealth. Government-owned land, private development. Some housing economies use a hybrid model where the government retains ownership of the land but leases it to private developers to build and manage housing on top of it. This gives the government long-term control over what kind of development happens without bearing the full cost of construction. Singapore's Housing Development Board operates partially on this principle, as does Hong Kong's land ownership system, where the government controls all land and generates significant revenue by leasing it to developers. The advantage is that the government can steer development toward public goals, affordability, density, mixed use, rather than leaving those decisions entirely to the market. The disadvantage is that this model requires a high level of institutional trust and competence. In cities where government is less transparent or more susceptible to corruption, land leasing arrangements can easily become a tool for rewarding politically connected developers rather than serving the public interest.